I mean, I come in and, the first thing I do is, I guess I should start the night before. The night before, I try to create a neutral space, right? So I'm not walking into anything that's gonna deter whatever I've thought of doing, the day of. And then I go in and I just decide if it's gonna be am I gonna turn the computer on today? Or it's stretching canvas and figuring out how to make that work with shapes that are like this. It's something that I've felt for a while, and have had a hard time putting words to. And the way I've kind of arrived here is through the lens of a few other artists. I think when we can take an approach where we think about the history of art and the history of abstraction, all the way back to Soviet era artists engaging abstraction as a response to political angst, right? Look at the tactish artists. We look at, Malevich and that clan of abstractionists and the means to why they made that work. Now, something happened between then and now. A lot happened, right? Like, world history. A lot of world history happened between then and now. And I think abstraction, just like all other art forms, kind of meander and change and shift their purpose. They do things, but I think by the time we embraced it wholeheartedly here in the States, it served a different purpose. And that kind of brings me to the next stage of the inherent political abilities of abstraction. I feel that it's, whether intentional or not, set up a circumstances that privilege a certain trajectory of thinking and marginalized a good portion of individuals that were thinking along those same lines. And so when I think about, very early Bearden paintings, very early Jacob Lawrence paintings, and I embrace the abstraction that was happening there, and I read their writings and hear their frustrations about having to decide if they wanted to engage in the art world. The types of works that were being demanded of them to make were oftentimes separate from the works that they were most passionate in making. And so I think somehow or another, being, I guess, considered a black abstractionist, in my opinion, inherently politicizes the work, even still today, because it's still this other segment to the notion of abstraction, and it's not quite still folded in. And so I feel like when we think about identity, when we think about notions of otherness, abstraction for me becomes the place not only to air those grievances, but a place to have that dialogue, because those questions are very abstract, and the answers and solutions to them are abstract to many. And so I think that's a kind of a long way of, the best way at the moment that I've been able to rectify that, come up with an answer for that question. I mean, I think about artists like, Sam Gilliam and his MLK paintings about the riots in DC, right? And how intensely emboldened those paintings are, and the gravity of being in front of those pieces without any sense of representation, and how moving they are, right? I think about Jack Whitman's 9/11. I mean, it's a painting, but it's an object, but it's a mural. The gravitas of how he's manipulating miniature tiles that he's made, you just can't reach that space for me. The spiritual height of that work, you just can't reach it through representation. I can't reach it through representation. Not to say that it can't be done. Edward Clark, for example. I mean, these are kind of, for me, like these pillars of artists that are just have done really great things, and maybe not have been recognized to the fullest of what could have been allowed at that time. And now we've got folks like Takwasi Dyson. We've got, Jimmy C. Jones. I mean, they're not knocking it out of the park, and bringing this political conversation through abstraction. And as someone, way down the line from those artists doing these really great things right now, it's super empowering to have that, to try to have that conversation, to be a part of that conversation. I think it's multi-pronged. And I don't go to the studio believing that painting is by any means the answer to these complex conversations. I think the arts play a significant role and have the ability to play a significant role in challenging the way people see things. And at the moment, I've got aspirations to do things with painting that exceed where these paintings are. But I don't feel like I'm ready to make them yet, primarily because I'm still working through the logistics of trying to understand how to make these paintings work, make them real, make them operate the way I think they best operate. And in those ideal ways, those ambitions include trying to create and borrow and appropriate from recognizable, inclusive moments in art history. Bring them in, retool them, break them apart at times, reforge them, but reforge them in a way that has an alternative outcome, a different result. And I think the allegory in that for me is that if I can have someone engage a work of art and recognize something familiar, but be conscious of the fact that it's not that, and they can't engage the work with the baggage that comes along with whatever that signifier is, let's say, then they're left on to themselves to articulate and to define what that is, what it is that they're looking at, and to square themselves to it and engage it in a way that makes sense for them. And I just think that if we're going to have a conversation about acceptance and inclusivity, what better way than to try to prove that it's possible by just having someone experience seeing something that doesn't look like they should like it or should engage it, or that something that feels like it doesn't have meaning, but yet it captivates you. I think art does that. And I think painting for me, my paintings have to do that. That's what I aim for, despite all the little things that help deviate one piece from another, right? We all have those things, that this piece is about this, or I'm responding to this, and, But beyond that, the work has to offer those types of challenging experiences of making folks move around to see it better. Can the surface of a painting do that? I think it can. I think you can make the material of paint, have someone see something different from this side and this side, and have them bring those two experiences together for a truer vision of the piece in their mind than there is in one static view. I think those are all the complex things that go into accepting people that are different than you, that exist and value things that are different than you. I built one, and then I realized that as much as I love building things, I'm not a carpenter. I'm a painter, and I'd rather be painting. And so I've gone through a quest of figuring out how these should be made, made me re-question the purpose of the stretcher. I'm a bit of a purist. I can't help it when it comes down to oil paint and just painting in general. In that the stretcher is supposed to be this thing to give you your support, lightweight, versus panel, all this good stuff. But I can't paint on panel. I'm not a fan of that. And stretched canvas has a very unique bounce to it that I just, you build a lexicon of painting gestures, and you take one of those variables out, and then none of them work anymore. And so for me, it was a problem solving how to keep the majority of the surface stretched and not wrapped over panel. That's where I started. It had to be 1.5 inches thick because it had to be conventional, heavy-duty stretcher depth. So that was a condition because the first shapes were just barely off square. So I had this idea that I was just breaking the square. The square had gotten bent out of shape over time, right? It had rounded edges or something like that. And so it had to have the signifiers of a recognizable stretched canvas on the wall. And then from there it just went, And so I worked with these pieces are cut out of cabinet grade ply. The stretchers, they're double laminated. I work with a CNC mill fabricator. I'd, come up with the shapes. I'd resolve the work at that stage. Like that's something that a lot of folks ask. Is like, do you know what you're gonna paint when you make the shape? And the answer is not really. And I tried that and failed, I think, tremendously. It was just too many processes involved. And so for me, I've got to come up with a theme for a project and then think about the shapes, think about the bodies that need to inhabit that space. And the bodies for me are each canvas. If the show is about a series of aggressive movements, then I'm either going to create shapes that have a confrontational sensibility to them, just based on the shape. Or maybe they have a very subverted, and I intend to maybe put something very aggressive on top of that. I don't know. But anyhow you look at it, once I've identified that, I go out and just draw. I draw a lot. Just scrolls and scrolls of paper of erasing and just creating, where the only problem isn't to create the painting space. It's just to come up with the uniqueness of the shape. And then once that's done, it's into the computer and then out, and measured down to the inch, and then sent out to be fabricated. They're all beveled on the inside the way a normal canvas would be, and a normal stretcher would be rather. Now the pieces that get joined together, that joinery I do in-house, because the first round I did outside, and then wasn't happy with the decisions that I had made by the time I got around to painting them. And so never again. So I work with graduate students at UW to kind of help and do the chiseling and the through drilling when it becomes a big task. But most of it is just myself, and I leave those options open up until the end. Like if you really look close on the back, you'll see several other holes for other possible configurations. In being a practitioner of like making stuff and building things, I just know I can't see that in the theoretical space. So I just get the individual components. So to use this painting as an example, I didn't do this with this painting, but just as a scenario here, I would order the individual shapes, get them all made up, and then play Legos in my studio, and kind of figure out physically what means what, you know what I mean? And then make the decision of how they kind of come together. And the pieces that are more or less nested into each other, that kind of creates a different situation. That's a lot of pre-planning, but those were inspired by elements that occurred naturally in the drawing. And so the drawings are seldom just contours. They kind of start from the center, work their way out, and I find the contours, and then sharpen it up. And so then there's these structural elements that happen inside of those shapes, and I'm like, oh, I want to see if I can integrate, a type of drawing into the painting without even drawing. It's architectural, you know what I mean? It's like two edges butting up against each other. And then I'm going to pair that against a hand-drawn line, Or in my most recent works, really integrating drawing language into the painting through graphite and other things like that. That kind of challenge that architectural line that might, scare you through the surface. And so I like to keep the options, but there is a time where you just commit. And I think that's just indicative of any painting, any art, any work that any artist is making. Is that there comes a time where you're like, no, this has got to happen. This has got to be done. This is going to be it. And any further ideas gets put on to the next process, right? And that's typically how I think about it. I think there's definitely been an evolution from the work since 17 to 20. Those 3 years, I kind of tucked away for a little bit because I had finally built up a large enough list of things that I wanted to solve that warranted me to say, okay, I'm only maybe going to focus on group projects. I'm going to hold off and push off all potential solo projects. I'm just going to focus on answering these questions, because if not, then I run the risk of just getting caught in a cycle of making the same or creating the same solutions to the same problems. It also coincided with the sabbatical, so it was like the perfect timing to just kind of like woodshed a bit. And so the questions that I tried to answer and that started this most recent work, which I showed a solo show of Harrison this summer that was the showcase of this 3 years of working, was trying to take this work out of this hard geometry. I started to feel super confined by the notion that I had this preconceived idea of geometric abstraction are always being so hard, and that just seemed to be a false narrative to me. It seemed to be something very much connected to a type of abstraction that I was kind of working against, or feeling as if I was trying to work against, so trying to move away from what's typically understood as like this type of minimal approach, very masculine, this, that, and the other. And that's a language that I'm just not interested in having anymore in the work. And so it was like, how can I create this sense of complex geometries, but in a language that's a lot more organic? And so I started with the shape itself and redefining the shape, limiting straight edges, and then kind of working that into impacting different paint modalities. And I came to a conclusion, the conclusion that I came to is that I don't have to paint the geometry, I just have to paint the effect of the geometry, And I still don't really know what that means 100%, but what it feels like is just the idea that you don't have to paint the light, you just have to know that it's there, you just have to paint the effect of the light across 2 or 3 objects. And then your viewer will know that there's a light there. They don't need to see the light. And thinking about geometry that way, it's like the only way for this painting gesture to fold this way is to think about it being draped over a structure. I don't have to paint the structure. All these pieces have structures, you see. And so the absence of a structure became this other kind of interesting thing that I have to now mill out. It means nothing right now in the work, but I feel that it has the potential to mean something, the absence of structures. And so I gotta think that's like for the future, and so this is what happens. I get into these things, these little discoveries, and then I just write them down and put them off. I'm not even equipped to know how to deal with that. I just need to just execute this. I need to figure out how to get that one push broom of paint that people recognize as being either connected to Richter, or I would rather consider it being connected to Ed Clark, way earlier than Richter with those gestures. I'm trying to figure out the logistics of how to get that paint from there across this invisible structure and then make that believable and paint it to the viewer. And when I can do that, then we can start talking about how to complicate that somehow, And so that's what the work is now. And this was a bit of a challenge because this is the first time I've had an exhibition of works that span a short amount of time in which the pieces were not made in relationship to each other. There are certain pieces that were made in the same time span, but most of them aren't. And so trying to think of a title that wouldn't be too descriptive to outline, any one specificity in all the work, because there kind of isn't one. When I first started to think about it, I was like, well, what is the common denominator here? And when I started to think about what I was doing in 2014, what I was trying to do, and what I did in 17, it made sense that I was losing myself in thinking of multi-dimensional geometries, and kind of getting excited about finding ways to create density within the lushness of flatness that painting offers, on the surface of the canvas. And I started taking a look through all the work, and on kind of a macro level, saw singular shaped canvases become multiple shaped canvases, and then within inside of the works, saw simple structures being mirrored together into more complex structures. And being a parent and being surrounded by blocks and seeing my toddler build blocks and build things, I said, oh my goodness, I'm still playing with blocks. And so that's a kind of a weird roundabout way to get to it, but it seemed to be the perfect title to make sense out of the trajectory of the work while also having a subtext. And the subtext for me was that we all are still playing with blocks. And I think it's not until we realize that we might be able to mature enough to have the challenging conversations that need to be had in this country. And so for me, abstraction has that potential to be about itself while simultaneously be inherently political. And so the title had to do that, had to give me a place to be able to talk about those things.